When we make God's name synonymous with a political party, then we have now made him responsible reputationally for all the evils in that political party. It may be the best of two options. We may argue that. It may be, in fact, may very clearly be that. But I'm like, the lesser of two evils is the nature of politics, but the lesser of two evils is still evil. And I do not want any evil associated with Jesus' name if I can help it.
I've only passed out one time, and it was with our next guest today. This was not drunk at a frat party, so it's not a Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings type story. It was instead, of all things, on the Southern Baptist Convention Resolutions Committee back in long time ago.
2003.
When a child of Biloxi, Mississippi humidity, found myself in Phoenix, Arizona, and a group of us went, we had one afternoon off and went into Scottsdale. I was not prepared for that level of dehydration and kind of got wobbly. J.D. Greear was there and has been.
I always assumed it was because of my dazzling intellect.
Well, it was that goes without saying, but I had kind of factored that in already. J.D. Greear is with us today. He is pastor of Summit Church in Raleigh-Durham area and is also the author of a new book called Everyday Revolutionary. That has just come out. And so I was really fascinated to read this. JD, thanks for being here with us today.
Man, thank you, Russell, for having me on with you.
You talk about in this book getting doxxed. Now, for those who don't know what that is, that's when somebody kind of publicly reveals, well, any kind of personal information about you, but your home address is one of those things. And that happened to you. How did that happen?
Well, yeah, it's the dilemma I open the book with, which is when you're a pastor and you're trying to lead your people in righteousness, and teach what the Bible says, but also recognizing that there can be a partisanship that goes with sometimes those proclamations and explanations of righteousness that's actually unhelpful for the mission that God has given to us. When and how do you connect the dots? Is it ever right? And I say that in general, I don't connect those dots all the time. What I do is I teach it and let people connect the dots when it comes to candidates and policies. But there are a few exceptions, and this was one of them. There was a measure in our community that would have just really, we thought, really hurt the responsibilities and rights of parents to instruct their children when it came to things like gender and sexuality. And so I connected the dots, and man, I just talked about it and said, I actually don't do this a lot, but I feel like this is a time we need to get out and vote on this particular issue. I mean, I always encourage people to vote, but, just actually laid it out for them. Well, it went over. It did not go over well. I mean, it went over great in our church. Our people actually appreciate the clarity, but there was a local professor who at one of these universities that just, she professed to be a Christian, and she just, man, she reamed me out on her blog and then kind of reposted something that had my address in it. Or somebody had said, hey, I dug up his tax records, here's his address. So then I'm getting, things dropped off at my house that are stories of people, tragic story, heartbreaking stories of people, committing suicide, that had gone through that stuff and tell me it was my fault. And I was all of a sudden like, oh my goodness, like, is this like a, what did I wasn't ever like hesitant about teaching what I taught, but I was like, did I, it's just the tension of like, how far is too far? And when is partisan activity the right thing to do and the only necessary thing to do? And when is it, when do you need to, I don't know. That's a tension I present because I feel like a lot of Christians are in that same spot.
You ended up talking to the person who doxed you, though, didn't you? After that,
yeah, I reached out and just said, hey, I'm okay with public disagreement. I don't even mind being publicly, raked over the coals where you think I'm wrong, but this feels like a little bit beyond the pale, and she was actually she started to cry. She said, I know that was wrong. things got the best of me, she said. And we ended up having an incredible conversation. I can't tell you that at the end, she left and we were seeing eye to eye. In fact, I keep up with her now, and we definitely don't see eye to eye on a whole lot. But something she said right at the end that really kind of like it's what put this story kind of so deeply in my heart when I was thinking about the subject of everyday revolutionary. She said, I feel like I've had to change my tone a little bit on your church, because she said my neighbor, who is she was either a widow or her husband had left her, but something like that. And she said she's just she's basically a mother now of kids without much help. And she said your church came in alongside of her and just she didn't go to your church, but you helped her. And she said, I just thought, well, if these people are doing these kinds of things with these people, then even if I disagree with them wildly on this, thing that I talked about, I recognize that there's a love that they have for our community. Again, I don't want to overplay this and say that she, was moved to agreement, but she saw that. And I thought that at least feels to me like what the Christian witness in society is supposed to be. The way I kind of say it tongue in cheek, Russell, is, I want our community to say about us, we may not believe what those crazy people at Summit believe, but thank God they're here, because if not, we'd have to raise our taxes. And I'm basing this on the story of Daniel in part, because here you get Daniel, in Babylon, who is so courageously truthful and counterculturally truthful that, he gets thrown in the lion's den. And not just once, by the way. He's always in trouble. Yeah. He's speaking truth about, forbidden foods for what he's allowed to eat. He's, confronting Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4 and calling out Belteshazzar in Daniel 5 and, openly praying in Daniel 6. And so he's so courageous, he ends up in the lion's den. And yet he's so beloved by the king whose wicked decree put him there, that king stands outside the lion's den all night long and weeps and hopes against hope that Daniel will make it through the night. And I'm like, how do you become like that in our community? Mm-hmm. Because, I don't think King Darius was doing that outside of the lion's den because he missed Daniel's prophetic diatribes. Mm-hmm. I think he was doing that because he knew Daniel was a friend to him. Daniel really loved him, and he was having a hard time imagining Babylon without Daniel anymore. And that's how we want to be in our community.
You said it was gut wrenching to receive these stories. So, you obviously see these people who are, suicidal, perhaps, mm-hmm. Even in a place of what feels like to them real hopelessness. You encounter people like that. I think that people assume because you're in a church that those people don't show up and talk to you, and you have those conversations. Like, how do you help them in a way that, obviously you're not going to change what you believe. But you also see these as human beings who are loved by God, and you want the best for them. How do you communicate that tension?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me start with the example of Jesus, or the description of Jesus, and then tell you how I practically have sought to apply that. John describes Jesus, the Apostle John describes Jesus as filled with grace and truth. Mm-hmm. Grace and truth. He wasn't half full of each. He didn't toggle back and forth like, now I'm in grace mode, now I'm in truth mode. Yeah. He was simultaneously always filled with both of them. And, the fact that John in his description actually puts grace first, scholars say is significant in Greek, because he's trying to emphasize that and say that Jesus actually led with grace, which means that even though he always told the truth in every situation, in fact, so much that it got him killed, what people remembered when they walked away from an encounter with him was they remembered the grace, which is that warmth of acceptance, not acceptance of the lifestyle or the wrong decisions, but it was just he loves me, he cares about me, and he's interested in the best for me. And when you think about like what it means to represent Jesus, it means that there's going to be these two sides. You're simultaneously filled with grace and truth. I always say that grace without truth is, let's just call it liberalism. And then truth without grace, that's Christless conservatism or damning fundamentalism. Either one of those will take you off the gospel road. All my life growing up in a very conservative context, and I'm still very conservative. I was warned about the ditch on the left side of the gospel road, the ditch of compromise. And I believe that ditch is real. And I believe, it's constantly beckoning the church into it, but nobody ever warned me about the ditch on the right side. And that's the ditch of being somebody who is filled with truth, but not at the same time so filled with grace that that's what people remember. Our world wants to say, and sometimes, unfortunately, the church plays along with this narrative, that when it comes to some of these decisions, whether we're talking about homosexuality or transgender questions, that the only two options are affirmation or alienation. These are the only two options you have. When really what the gospel offers is a different thing, which is clarity with truth about the sinfulness of whatever we're talking about, but at the same time, this embrace that says, I actually love you, I believe in you, and I want to be a good neighbor to you, even when you are living in ways or believing things that are very opposite of what I believe.
How do you know when to, and let's kind of put to the side the sort of really hot button culture war issues and just talk about any kind of change? I mean, obviously, we kind of bear patiently with people. And I know you've been in the situation, I've been in the situation where we've got somebody and we're like, look, this person's got a lot of issues that I need to deal with in his or her life. But right now, I'm going to deal with first. I want to get this person to recognize that he or she needs Jesus. Then we'll talk about having a quiet time later. That's down the road. How do you know when to sort of have patience with somebody and say that's something that when that person's more discipled, we can deal with, and when to say, okay, this has to be dealt with right now?
Yeah, I feel like to me, 90% of the answer to that question, Russell, where people go wrong with it is not recognizing one of the two sides that you just laid out, which is there are times when Jesus himself would, I'm not sure if this is the right word to use, but he would almost punt an issue. He would say, many things I have to say to you right now, but you're not able to bear them. Right. He's just saying, hey, there's a time and we're going to get there. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, after one of the greatest, chapters on an approach to sexuality, still, written 75 years ago, and we still, think that. He says at the end, he's like, hey, if this chapter has made you where you're like, you can't even think straight anymore because it's so counter. He said, hey, why don't we just table this for just a few minutes, a little while. The center of Christianity, he says, is not a particular approach to sexual ethics, even though it's very important. The center of Christianity is the lordship of Christ. And once you accept the lordship of Christ, then he will lead you in these areas. So let's deal with the empty tomb and the person on the throne before we deal with all the ramifications. That's one side of it. Mm-hmm. The other side of it that you have to recognize is that lordship means something. And you can't come to Jesus and say, well, I'm going to say, say that confess your Lord, but then just ignore whatever you say that I don't agree with. So, the answer is there's a perception when you're talking with people. It's harder to do with a whole audience because, everybody's at a different place. But when you're doing one-on-one with somebody, of recognizing, is this an issue that is wiser to kind of table so that we can deal with the lordship of Christ? Or does this actually represent something that Jesus, it's kind of what the rich young ruler did with his money. And we're going to put it front and center and say, are you willing to obey him here? And there have been times when I have said to people, in whether it's a hot button, cultural issue, or whether it's just something like money, and said, hey, I really perceive here that this is the obstacle. And are you willing to let Jesus be Lord here? Because to become a Christian doesn't mean that you die to your view of sexual ethics. It means you die to everything. It means you repent of anything that is in conflict to Christ. And that includes hot button cultural issues, but, a lot of other stuff as well. One
of the things that it seems to me Jesus is facing a lot are fake controversies. So you have religious leaders, for instance, seeking to trap him in his words, the Gospels say. And you're right, Jesus responds in different kinds of ways. I mean, I think of when he throws back at them the baptism of John, was it from heaven or was it from men? And when they say, well, we don't know, his answer is, well, then I'm not going to tell you the answer to your question. How do you differ? I mean, it seems like we're in a time when there are a lot of those kinds of controversies. It might be that the issue is real, but it's people who are looking to have a fight and to try to find some reason to be in opposition to one another. How can you tell when that's what's going on?
Man, that's a great question, Russell. I wish I felt like if I had that, I could just be an amazing counselor to a lot of a lot of different Christian leaders. I mean, there's definitely the spirit perception. There's sort of the awareness of what's going on. I was in a conversation not long ago where I don't know, I'm not claiming supernatural knowledge, but there was a discernment of like, hey, the reason you're actually wanting to say this is because there's a fear here. There's a cowardice. And I needed to confront the cowardice. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I've been with people on the other side where I've actually called out, say, I don't really feel like this is the issue at all. I feel like there is whether it's a self-righteousness or whether there's a refusal to see the log in your own eye because you're focusing on the splinter in your brother's eye. That's really what's at work here. I don't know if there's a one size fits all answer. I mean, it's one of the reasons that those of us who are called to be preachers and teachers in God's church, it's one of the reasons we commit ourselves to expository preaching, because, I'm at least letting Jesus and the scriptures take the lead on what I'm talking about where. Beyond that, I mean, that's why we call him the wonderful counselor, not me. I need him and his spirit leading me in situations, giving me the same discernment that he had, so that hopefully people will say about me what they said about the apostles. They'll take note that I've been with Jesus. I expect fully that, in fact, if you're kind of doing it right, it means you're taking flack from both sides, because I always like to point out to our church, Jesus's crucifixion was a joint project between the so-called secular left and the religious right. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean they're morally equivalent. I'm not saying they're equally morally bad. I'm just saying at the end of the day, there were these two sides that were opposed to him for different reasons. And if we represent him today, those two spirits, those two leaven, is the word that Jesus used. They're still at work in the world today, and they're still just as resistant to the gospel.
You talk about in the book this unique experience of being in Raleigh-Durham, which is kind of a purple situation, a mostly red state lately, blue cities within that place. And you talk about Raleigh being that little hole in the Bible Belt where you put the buckle prong, which I like that analogy. What's different, do you think, about doing ministry in a place like that?
Well, I don't want to write off half of my city mm-hmm. and just say that they're beyond the gospel because I've put a gateway between them and the gospel. Now, I want to be very clear. If the gateway is preaching controversial things and hard truths, then, I have to be a faithful teacher of God's word, and that means teaching both the popular and the unpopular. But also recognize that when you put sometimes a certain label on things, you can create, because, there's a whole package that goes into the word Republican and Democrat or left or right. And there are things that are deeply biblical, and there are things that are extra biblical, and sometimes things that are unbiblical. And I'm like, well, I just need to separate that out, because I don't want, the apostles spent a lot of time trying to separate out gospel essentials from cultural non-essentials. They weren't out arguing to Gentiles that Jewish culture was really the way to go, because it was a kind of pre-evangelism, to become a Gentile was to actually, become a Jew. They said, no, this is what is essential. I feel like I'm trying to do that in the leadership that I'm giving, and saying, I don't want to make it hard for anybody. And so I've got to preach truth that sometimes sounds partisan, but to do it in ways that avoid the labels. I don't think that I'm being cowardly when I do that. One of the examples I use in the book is, when Jesus calls his disciples, there's a little one-word identifier he gives to two of them, and only two of them. Matthew refers to himself as the tax collector. He refers to Simon as the zealot, which tells you, if nothing else, they were divided on the most emotionally charged political issue of the day, what to do about Roman occupation. Mm-hmm. And here you got Matthew, the tax collector. Their reasoning was, hey, this is a God-appointed authority. It's best just to submit to them. The zealot's like, nope, this is, you're usurping God's authority, stolen the land. The faithful thing is to do what Samson did and, be zealous in opposition to them, guerrilla warfare. Both of them use Bible verses to back up their approach. What's interesting is that Jesus brings both of them in, with their labels. I'm sure they had some spicy conversations around that campfire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of feel like Jesus probably made them room together, so they knew by their tent late at night, their fingers are in each other's faces and they're, they're arguing like a couple of seminary students over Calvinism. They're just going at it. But the point was he brought him
as
in.
you and I did when we were seminary students.
Exactly. That's why I thought of that analogy. But ultimately Jesus's kingdom teaching would transform the viewpoint of both of them. You might argue Simon's even more than Matthew's. It was so, I'm not saying he just brought them in and left them the way they were, but the point was he did not make, conformity or switching labels. He didn't make that a prerequisite for discipleship. What I try to explain in the book is that these things are the result. Political transformation is the result of discipleship. It should not be the gateway to it. And that's what we're trying to do when we are representing Christ faithfully, is to put out the essentials, the unpopular non-essentials, but also try to keep the non-essentials away from it so that we don't make it hard for people who are turning to God. There's one story I tell in there about a young lady at our church who first I really saw her or heard from her. She sent me a picture of her being baptized at our church. I hadn't been there the day that she got baptized. She says she basically told me a story of how I had tweeted out something, basically an affirmation of a pro-life position. Mm-hmm. And she had sniped back at me. And Russell, I mean, yeah, I know you know this. I never respond on Twitter. Yeah. I mean, just because it's a bazillion reasons. Right. But I don't know what came over me. I did. In that moment, I was like, Mom, her name was like Left Linda. It was something that I clearly identified her as, but I and she sniped back and we went at it 2 or 3 times. And then I forgot about it. Well, then I get this letter and she says, I was Left Linda. She said, I'd already started to come to your church. A lot of stuff that you taught, whether it was about the sanctity of life or marriage or, gender stuff. She said, it made me mad. She said, but I came enough that God got a hold of my heart and I got saved, and now I'm rethinking everything. It was starting to transform everything. She said, I want to thank you that even though that you were saying some of these hard things, I want to thank you that even then you didn't make this the Republican church. She said, because I just came from the University of California. She said, if this had been known as the Republican church, she said, I never would have stepped foot in there and I wouldn't have heard the gospel and gotten saved. And I thought, okay, here you've got hopefully the balance, at least I would like to strive for, which is clarity and truthfulness about hard things, and yet trying to stay back from what would actually put an unnecessary impediment, because there are certain things I just don't want attached to Jesus's name. And I hope I'm not rambling here, but there's one other thing that that just is like a soul passion for me. The third commandment tells us to not take the Lord's name in vain. And, we know that means more than just not using it as a cuss word. What that means is that you don't ever associate God's name with things that are unworthy of him. When we make God's name synonymous with a political party, then we have now made him responsible reputationally for all the evils in that political party. It may be the best of 2 options. We may argue that. It may be, in fact, maybe very clearly be that. But I'm like, the lesser of 2 evils is the nature of politics, but the lesser of 2 evils is still evil. And I do not want any evil associated with Jesus' name if I can help it, because that's my responsibility, is to keep the reputation of Jesus clean, so to speak, and to keep the way of salvation clear.
One of the earliest memories that you and I have been friends for a long time, one of my earliest memories of our work together was you talking to somebody, another Christian, but they were giving a really caricatured view of what Muslims believe and put it all in one category. And of course, you had been doing work on reaching Islamic people with the gospel, and you stepped in and said, no, that's not how they would say that. And you were kind of inhabiting for a minute the viewpoint, what they would see going on, in order to say you can't talk to them. They're not going to listen to them if you don't fairly represent what they think they're doing. Do you think that kind of early work helped you prepare you to be a pastor later on?
Russell, if I could be made czar of the Christian world and you gave me a scepter and I could just execute my will,
Yeah.
I would say every Christian leader and pastor ought to spend at least a couple of years on the mission field. I would make that, because it really does. It kind of changes how you think about what are we trying to do. I believe that Muslims, I believe they teach a false religion. I believe they're wrong, but also know that to win somebody is different than throwing red meat out to a Baptist crowd from a stage. Mm-hmm. And it's a different set of tools. It's the tools that Jesus used that made him be hated by people, the Pharisees, because he was known as the friend of sinners. And yeah, I would like to think that formed, now I feel like, one of the things I really appreciated about the late Tim Keller was that he was very committed to explaining his adversaries' views, the secular progressivist, the atheist, in ways that they would say, okay, that's a really good representation of my views.
Yeah.
That's actually maybe the best I've heard it said in short form. And then Tim would try to refute it. Now I feel like, especially with a lot of stuff you deal with, you're like, there's somebody who says something that you say you believe, and you're like, I definitely don't believe that. I'm telling you, I don't believe that. Yeah. And they're still trying to tell everybody that that's what you really believe. And I'm like, I'm telling you, I don't believe that. We've gone beyond even just, I do a really good job of understanding you and articulating your position to, I need you to fit a certain caricature, because that's how I get my base riled up. Mm-hmm. And that is, I feel like that phrase that Paul uses, not even the Gentiles have this kind of the New York Times has better editorial standards than that. And somehow that just becomes accepted as okay because it's the way to get clicks and to recruit followers.
Tim and I have had an atheist friend, still my friend, that a group of us would meet once a week. And this atheist, even though he would disagree on everything, theologically, culturally, whatever, with Tim, loves him, and loves still. We talk about him all the time. And one of the kind of key moments was he was asking Tim about the problem of evil. And Tim said, well, here's what I think. And he gave him what he thought. And then he said, that gets me 80% of the way there. Doesn't get me 100% of the way. It gives me 80% of the way there. And I trust Jesus with the rest of it. Wow. And this guy was really, he said he wasn't marketing to me. He easily could have given me a slick presentation of how the problem of evil perfectly is answered by whatever his argument is. And the fact that he didn't do that gave him an extra credibility. I think about that all the time.
Molly Worthen, who maybe some of your listeners are familiar with, she is a UNC professor.
Yeah, she was a guest on the show.
Oh, wait, okay. Yeah. She actually says that was really important in mine and her relationship as she was coming to Christ, is to admit, like, hey, this is, I think, the best answer. It's the answer I'm persuaded of. But I recognize that somebody sitting in your seat, I can understand where the doubt comes from. And I'll be honest with you, there's times that I have doubt. I don't think it's weakening the case for Christ when you say there's a lot of, Psalm 131, I still got some things that are just too high and too wonderful for me. And I'm clinging to, Jesus's resurrection because it is the best explanation for what happened in the first century. And I believe he's the Son of God, but I believe, help my unbelief. Where else can I go? You alone have the words of eternal life. And I think that's an important part. One of the things she says, and I hope I don't get in trouble for this, but feel free to cut this out of the show if you don't like it. But, we were talking about the eternal destination of those outside of Christ. And I said, well, here's what I believe the Bible teaches. Here's why I believe it. I believe it's a very compelling case, but I'm going to be honest with you. I kind of hope I'm wrong. I'd love to get to heaven and find out, oh, you missed this right here. And God say, this is a way that I'm going to redeem people. I don't believe that now because I don't think it's biblically justifiable, but yeah, there's a lot of this that I struggle with and I wish were true. And she said that really helps because it shows that you're somebody wrestling in with this with me, and you're leading me to a place where you found at least enough assurance and certainty to be able to go forward.
One of the things that you talk about people misrepresenting somebody's viewpoints. One of the things that drives me crazy, and it happens every once in a while, is people will try to sum up the argument of our mutual friend David Platt, his book Radical, and saying, "Oh, he's saying that ordinary life and the ordinary means of grace don't matter." And I always say that's not what his argument is at all. And we'll talk about it then. But I noticed that you in this book, I mean, even with the title "Everyday Revolutionary," that both of those aspects are important. Why is that the case?
Most Christians, they really want to be bold, and they want to be part of, seeing Jesus's great awakening and revival on earth. That's the revolutionary aspect. But, they got to get up 8 o'clock tomorrow morning and they got to go to work. What does that actually look like? What does boldness look like in a world where many of our basic Christian worldviews are no longer shared? In fact, some of them now are outside the so-called Overton window. And what do you do with that? And Paul's answer, Peter's answer, is actually kind of surprising when you get to it, because Paul, his command is to live quietly, which you're like, Paul's telling me to live quiet. Isn't this the guy that stood in an Ephesian amphitheater and pointed his finger at the crowd and said, "You worship gods that are no gods at all"? Mm-hmm. This feels odd coming from him. But what he's meaning is there's a way of living like Daniel lived, where you so love and bless your neighbors that it sets you up for loud testimony. And living quietly is the everyday part. What I try to do in the book is I reduce that or crystallize that into 5 things that every believer can do basically every day with their job, whether they're, go to elementary school and teach 3rd graders, or whether they're the CFO of a multinational conglomerate. And that is, the work that we do is creation fulfilling. And what I mean by that is you're obeying God's creation commission to beautify the earth and make it a better place for humans to live in. The second thing is your excellence pursuing. Daniel had an excellent spirit in him, and that showed up by the fact that he did things. He was no negligence or corruptness was found in him. So everything he did was excellent. Paul commands us to do that, in Colossians. Then it's the third one is holiness reflecting, where we're just reflecting the holiness of God and by living with the highest levels of integrity and the way we do our jobs. Redemption displaying, which means that even in a free market economy, Christians have this penchant for grace and radical expressions of generosity and grace. And then the last one is mission advancing, that is where you're looking for ways, as you're doing the previous 4 things, where you, 1 Peter 3:15, are able to give a reason for the hope that is within you that drives you to those things. Those things are the quiet life. It's what you do every day. It's what the majority of Christians in the world, majority of listeners to your program will probably do every day, but it's going to set you up for moments of loud testimony where you are able to explain this hope. I'm not trying to pull anybody back from zealousness in sharing the gospel. What I'm trying to do is say there's a full orbed way that you can actually make an impact in, what some call a negative world that we live in with respect to Christianity. Leslie Newbigin, who I know you're very familiar with, is a missionary to India between 1936 and 1974, so nearly 40 years. And Leslie Newbigin, when he returned to Great Britain, said that Britain had changed so much in those 40 years that he'd been gone. He said that ministers in Great Britain were going to have to learn the skills of the foreign missionary if they were going to make an impact on their society. He said that's different than it was in the 1930s. And he said one of the skills of the foreign missionary is showing that the gospel, Christianity, actually gives you a much more full and comprehensive life, and that becomes the platform out of which you're able to explain the gospel. And I think that's a crucial tool for believers today, which is a big theme and a big part of the reason I wrote the book.
That's more complicated now, isn't it? Because the everyday sort of living quietly. I mean, if you think about first century, nobody had to sort of decide, what am I going to do with my life? You right. were going to be a fisherman or a carpenter,
right.
And in the last 40, 50 years. Most people, you kind of made that decision once, at least generally. This is kind of what I'm going to do. Now, most people are going to be doing multiple things over their lives, even if you're skilled in one particular area. I mean, a doctor in the AI era is going to be a totally different thing than being a doctor before the AI era. And I think there are a lot of people who wonder, I know that I ought to have a certain kind of joy in what I'm doing. I also know that there's going to be thorns and thistles, sweat of the brow.
Yeah.
How do I know when I'm doing the wrong thing or when I'm just having the normal kind of friction that comes with living that quiet life?
Yeah, I feel like I have this conversation a lot with young professionals at our church, because most of them, and I actually think it's a true thing where, like we're created in the image of God, which means you're created for work. And as much as you can, if you can find that work where it doesn't feel like work, where you feel like you're doing what you're created to do, that's an awesome place to be. And different ones of us to different degrees get to experience that. But there's also a curse that we're under when it comes to work. And even if you love medicine and you love law, it's going to feel sometimes like toil. And there's some of us whose jobs, on that continuum are a little bit more on the toil side and less on the, I love this, side. I think there's truth in all of it. D.A. Carson always said error is usually just truth out of proportion. And so sometimes you can take the truth of we're created for work and you can turn that into an idol. And where it becomes something like if you don't get up every day and burst into tears as you're on your way to work because you're just so happy to be there, that somehow you messed around, your boss is to blame, and you find a different job. That's one side, and the other side is where people just feel like, I just do this because I'm trying to pay the bills so that I can tithe to my church and be involved in the visitation program. Well, that's not it either. There's something that's a little bit of both. And so, man, I just encourage people to take that wisdom is usually found in holding together tensions in the Bible that you have to hold both of them at the same time. These are not contradictions to be resolved.
I was talking here on this show not too long ago about the fact that I went back and I was looking. I don't know what prompted me to do this, but I was looking at what books of the Bible I have preached or taught the most and which the least. And there were two books I realized I had never taught from. Nehemiah and Esther.
Wow.
And it just had never done that. So Beth Moore we're gonna talk about Esther one day, just the whole time here. But you spend a lot of time with Esther, and there was a time when I said, if I hear for such a time as this one more time, I'm going to gouge my eyes out, because it just had become such a cliche. But what can we learn from Esther now?
Yeah.
Maybe
you got Southern Baptist blood, which is why for such a time as this was literally every capital campaign, every evangelism initiative ever in the history of the church.
Together we build from Nehemiah. So don't think that's not related.
So, if we're bringing it back to the center where we're not reacting and overreacting, so Esther is actually fascinating because most people don't put together that Esther is written kind of in the same era as Daniel is. And it's basically, it's what does it mean to be a faithful Jew in the midst of a very hostile, so-called negative world. Daniel's one of the only books in the Old Testament that's not written in Hebrew. The intro and the conclusion are in Hebrew because it's written for Jews, but the narrative parts are in Aramaic. And the structure of the book itself is like presenting a question. You know how to obey God in Hebrew. Can you do it in Aramaic? Well, Esther's the same way. It's written in Hebrew, but here you've got Esther, and people make a big deal of the fact that God's name is never mentioned in the book. But I actually think I'm persuaded that's an artistic tool that the author is using to say God's name is not known here. If you know how to read the book, his fingerprints are everywhere, and his calling of Esther, that is something that's very real. But what does it mean to be faithful to God when his name is not on everybody's lips and he's not even credited for the things that he should be credited for? And what you find is that it's going to require moments of incredible bravery. There's a lot of complexity in Esther's role there in Persia. And man, it's just, it's going to be, we're going to have some challenging days. I'm not a doomsday person, but I mean, there's going to be some challenging days. They're not unknown to the church. I mean, you said a minute ago, how much more complex it is today to find a job. Yeah, but there's some ways that man, we got it pretty easy compared to what they, in the first century, unless you offered a, little pinch of incense to Caesar, you couldn't buy and sell in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in those days may be coming for us. It may not look like a pinch of incense to Caesar, but it might be, certain adoption of certain, social moral agendas that we just feel like we can't do. And like Esther, there will come a time where we say, I got to choose between prosperity and faithfulness. And that's going to be a difficult time. I feel like you can learn that from Esther, that God actually intended this time because he's doing something in his church. We don't have to like it. Listen, I mourn the loss of any foundation of Christian ideals in our community. I mean, I know, it's a mixed bag, but man, it makes our ministry a lot more difficult. I mourn that. I don't want it, but I know that there's a way of faithfulness in it. And stories like Esther and Daniel show me how. And the books of First Peter, it's written basically it's evoking the metaphors of Esther and Daniel to say, hey, you exiles who are living in a place ruled by Nebuchadnezzar where God's name is not known. Here's how you can be faithful, and here's what God intends to do with it.
There are some people who would say evangelism has changed, not in terms of the evangel, not in terms of the gospel, but they will say we're in a very different time what will you say to God when he says, why should I let you into heaven? But you're dealing with people who don't ever think about something happening after they're dead. It doesn't make sense to them. Is that right? Do you think that we're in a different moment in terms of the way that we initiate the conversation with people who haven't been in some sort of a culturally Christian mix?
Yeah, as long as you don't overplay that, I think that's true. I actually was in East Germany earlier this year and working with the churches we've helped plant over there and a little network of churches. And they say East Germany is the most secular place on the planet. I mean, Mecca is less Christian, but East Germany is where most people say they have no religion. And so I got to sharing Christ with one of the local German pastors over there with a young lady we'd met. And man, I went in on the normal questions, about death and dying. And all I can tell you is watching her eyes while I was talking, it was not resonating. Mm-hmm. I was laying out my best, if you died tonight moments, kind of. And then I watched him, this pastor who's, obviously from there, he started to explain to her, he said, I want you to imagine that you were in a room filled with the most priceless, beautiful art you'd ever seen. He goes, but as you look around, you notice that it's ripped, it's defaced, it's scattered on the floor. He said, and you know that this was once, or it was intended to be a beautiful room, but it's actually just filled with destruction and scars. He says, don't you feel like sometimes that's what the world we live in is like? And I'm telling you, on her face, she was tracking. And she was leaning into those questions in ways that she just had not been with mine. And I kind of learned something from him. I'm like, it's not that what I was saying was untrue. And I actually think there is a time and a place to talk about, the surety of judgment that's coming. But he touched something deep in her that resonated with a question that she asked about herself and her life and her community all the time. And so, yeah, I think that there's truth in that. I just would be careful to overplay it because there is, the gospel is the gospel and judgment is judgment. And we have to awaken people to eternal things, not ignore them and pretend that this is just an existential fix for an unhappy life.
One of the things I think a lot of people thought would happen is that secularization would take place in a stripping away of religious content, and people would become just more and more consumed with only what they can see and feel and touch and do and consume. But in reality, we're seeing a lot of different kinds of spiritualities come into the mix after Christianity. Do you speak differently to somebody who is, I just don't believe anything. I'm, trying to earn my degree here at UNC Chapel Hill, or I'm working here at Duke, and I just that's all I'm focused on. From somebody who say is really into astrology, or those kinds of spirituality that we see booming, not just in North America but all over the world.
Right. Yeah. I think for both of them, we take a cue from the apostles and we go back to the resurrection. I think there are paths, as long as you don't overplay them. There are paths from astrology and spiritualism. There are paths to the gospel. I don't mean paths to heaven. I mean, like, ways to get to the need for Jesus. But I think this is where we learn from the Apostle Paul. Luke describes his preaching, Acts 17, as Paul came preaching the resurrection. And he was like, hey, there is this thing that this eternal thing that you're yearning for in astrology and spirituality. It actually came as a person. And that's the best explanation for his life, is that he was divine. The only explanation for what happened, in early Palestine, was that he actually rose from the dead. I think we are seeing, and this is really key in Molly's story too, is we're seeing a kind of a re-emphasis on the truthfulness of the resurrection. And I think that's not just something for our culture. I think that's something for Christianity in all time. The Christianity that you and I grew up in Russ, you would have really talked about it as the cross is the center. And believe me, I'm not downplaying that at all. I mean, I wrote a book called Gospel that's about the centrality of the cross. But, for the apostles, they were preaching the resurrection. That was sort of the tip of the spear. And, penal substitution and those things are all part of what they're preaching. But I think we're in a place where the resurrection has become even more relevant than ever.
I talk, as you do, every week with pastors who get honest and can get honest when they're not having to stand up in front of people and talk. And a lot of them, I mean, just this week, I had multiple conversations with pastors in very different settings who are ready to quit because they're just under different kinds of pressures than they were under before. And a lot of it is stuff they didn't sign up for and don't really feel that they're gifted to do. What is something, we've got a lot of listeners who are lay people and they really do have a good pastor. They want to support that pastor and they don't know how to. You obviously can't stand up and say to your people, hey, here's a way to help and appreciate me. But you can tell.
I mean, it is Pastor Appreciation Month. It is October, so just going to say that.
But you can tell people, hey, here's how you can do that for your pastor who might be really discouraged and you'd never know it because you're not going to get up and say that. So how would you encourage them to do that?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Russell. That's just such a great question. And I feel like a lot of your listeners are like, I mean, yeah, this is what I want to do. There's a few things I would say. The first one is, hey, realize that they need that encouragement. I mean, people just kind of assume, that pastors stay encouraged. People ask me, I've been at the church I pastor now 23 years. As the lead pastor. And people say, well, how have you made it 23 years? I'm like, well, one of my mentors told me never quit when you're tired or discouraged. So I've never had a week that I could quit because I was always tired and discouraged. But, realize that they kind of live with that. There's multiple reasons for that. And this is kind of the second thing, don't make the only time that you reach out to them, when you hear something in the message you want to question or push back on. There are people that I hear from at our church about once every 7 years, and all they want to talk about is some little phrase and why I shouldn't have used it. And I'm like, really? You've listened to me preach, 300 sermons, and none of them edified you to the point that you wanted to reach out. You just wanted to comment on this. There's a phrase we use on our staff team here at Summit, and that is you should notice the strengths and assume the weaknesses instead of vice versa, instead of noticing the weaknesses and assuming the strengths. And it just means that, people mess up. That's just part of it. Sometimes you need to call it out, but what you should really call out are those strengths and do that for your pastor. Pray for them. One of the things has helped me in my own, just kind of dealing with all this stuff, is that little phrase in 1 Peter where Peter's talking about suffering as a pastor, as a minister. And he says, you were called to this. This is not just the unfortunate byproduct. It literally was part of the calling. And I'm like, when I get maligned or misrepresented, treated unfairly, criticized, man, I hear that voice in the back of my head from that scripture saying, hey, JD, you were called to this. I'll deal with that person, on my own, but you were called. I pointed you to go through this kind of suffering because this is part of the package. So, man, you just remind them, encourage them, and be crazy generous to their family. I've always wanted my kids to say, man, one of the greatest things was being on the staff at the Summit Church, and they took care of us. And I will frequently, I don't ask for a whole lot for myself, but I'll be like, hey, would you in this season, would you mind doing this for my kids? If you're going to if you want to give me a raise or something, why not actually put their name on it and something they would really love, and just bless their family, send them out to dinner, send them out, just something that just says, we are with you and we love you. You'll be shocked how far that will actually go with that touch.
Summit Church is a very big church, obviously. Do you think that there will be mega churches 20 years from now?
I think so. Yeah, I think everybody was, crying the downfall, in 2020, like we're all going to be online and house churches. And I feel like those doomsday predictions, will there be them in 50 to 100 years? I mean, that may be a question. I think in 10 years, no question about it, 20 years. But the nature of it will change. I mean, our church is, we just had a service where we baptized I think 367, and then another 100 or so the next week or two. You're seeing a lot of people right now are pointing out that Gen Z is coming back to church. Praise God for that. I mean, part of that is it's that thing where I think they're seeing the intellectual and moral bankruptcy of secular progressivism and woke ideology, or however you want to say that. They're seeing how that is a crumbling foundation, and that's driving them to look for something more secure, more certain. We'll change. We'll do whatever it takes to reach people, and that means changing our method and our models if need be in a biblically appropriate way. But I think right now is a time for evangelism and for us to put the gas pedal down.
One of the things we always like to do at the end here is to say you're on a desert island for the rest of your life. Your memory is going to be fading. You know that ahead of time on this desert island, and you have to choose 5 books of the Bible to take with you for the rest of your life, and only those 5. What do you choose?
5 books of the Bible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's got to be Romans.
Okay.
Right? It's got to be Genesis, because like one of my professors told me, Genesis is basically everything you know about the Bible. Everything after that's just footnotes. So Genesis and so Romans and Genesis. I think if I were good there, I'd have to take me some Revelation, just because there's just no way to replace it was written on a desert island, from a guy so it feels like he could identify with me. The Psalms, because of just the cry of the heart. I mean, the older you get and the more you experience disappointment and, this veil of tears, that we call life, you find so much of the Psalms make sense. I'll be honest, a lot of the Psalms didn't make sense to me when I was a teenager. I nod my head at them, but they just didn't make sense. And now I'm like, I know what that feels like right there. Last one would be, it'd be Nehemiah. So if my friend Russell Moore shows up, I'd know I could take him to the book and show him what it meant.
J.D. Greear is the author of Everyday Revolutionary. His home address is, won't do that part.
Yeah.
You need to check out that book and see it. And J.D., thanks so much. It was always good to talk to you.
Man, likewise, Russell. Thank you.